Good morning, guys. I'm Blackie and welcome back to the channel. Today we will be dealing with my thoughts to a practical field guide for the Cowboy bedroll. Now, the Cowboy bedroll is simply, in a nutshell, one of the oldest forms of portable bedding that we have. No matter what the materials are, the idea is basically the same. From biblical times of shepherds, in the fields guarding their flocks, who would carry sheep hides to lay on the ground and lay upon. Probably the ancient caveman carried some sort of bundle of fur with them or whatever. And the Native Americans out on the plains, and that's something you don't hear much about today. We hear about woodsmen, we hear about mountain men, but plainsmen. Those were people that had learned to thrive out in the great grassland in the central part of the United States, as well as other places around the world like that. They did not have the resources of trees that they could build quick shelters out of. They could have a constant roaring fire going. When they got in those areas in the American Great Plains, they had buffalo chips for fuel. That was it. So they didn't have wood to build shelters, more or less run a fire. What did they have? And how did they make themselves comfortable in all these weathers and conditions? So we're going to deal with the basic concept of it. And for the rest of this video, I'm going to, instead of saying Cowboy bedroll, I'm simply going to say the bedroll. Okay? It's easy to look at and see the obvious points, but it's the subtle details, the subtle techniques that's going to greatly improve your comfort. So that's what I'm going to be dealing with. I'm going to give you points and improvements and ways of doing it to get the most out of such a simple concept. Now, the bedroll consists of three key components. The first one is the outer cover. Then we have the inner cover. Then we have the base or ground that we're going to modify. Let's start with that first point, the outer cover. The outer cover needs to be water resistant, waterproof. It can be as simple in modern times as a big sheet of plastic like bisqueen plastic or Tyvek. It can be as elaborate as a 10 by 10 foot canvas tarp. The purpose of the outer cover is to protect us from moisture from the ground and from weather, rain, etc. This is the tent, so to speak, that we're going to fold around us to insulate us from weather, wind, rain, moisture, etc. It needs to be something strong enough and tough enough that when we lay it on the ground, and ground is very abrasive, it doesn't easily get a hole in it when we put our body weight on it and start rolling around on it, so it doesn't get ground into the sand or the dirt or whatever. And so we need to be focused on that when we pick our site. But it needs to be something big enough that when we fold it in half, it completely encompasses us with room to spare. And that's important. A bedroll needs to be roomy for reasons, and we will discuss that when we set this up on the ground in a minute. But this would be an outer cover. It can be many things, but this would be a good outer cover. For this demonstration, I'll be using a surplus U.S. Army tarp as the outer cover. Also, I would be remiss not to mention, a Ranger roll is in itself a bedroll. It consists of a poncho liner, and a reusable space blanket, all put together to form a bedroll. Okay? But you see how big and bulky. Any of these bedrolls are going to be big and bulky. You're not going to get something super compact and be comfortable. Okay? Bedroll, by definition, is bulky. Now, the second part, the inner. The inner, depending on the time of the year and what the conditions are, needs to be our warmth layer. It is how we actually envelop around ourselves for warmth, or to some degree the padding. Okay? It can be a big, thick wool blanket. And if you look at the ones that you see advertised for Cowboy bedrolls today, you will see how a lot of times it's a heavy canvas outer cover that's been waterproofed. Then there's a pad sewed into the bottom of it. And then there's some sort of wool or fleece or whatever, really warm outer blanket that's inside to cover up with. This is how you have the outer cover, the inner cover working together to create this ground tent, basically. And the inner cover acts as the warmth factor. Now this can be as big and bulky as conditions require. So if I'm going to be laying down in snow, I need a very big, thick. In fact, it is not outside of the realm to take a big sleeping bag, like a big down sleeping bag, and put inside of a tarp and call it a bedroll. See, for this demonstration, I'll be using a poncho liners to show for the inner. Now we come to the most in-depth part, the base. The base is the ground beneath us and what we're going to do to make ourselves more comfortable. Now, an old Marine friend of mine passed on a piece of wisdom to me many years ago. I want you to remember this. It takes no effort to be miserable. So if you want to take a super thin little silk nylon tarp and a paper towel thin little poly whatever blanket and roll them up to something that big and use it as a bedroll, that's completely on you. But to get comfort out of that, you're going to have to do a great deal of work for the base to lay that upon, because you're not intrinsically carrying it in the roll. Now you've got to create it in the base. So, underneath us, the base, at the root core, what is the best? And so I'm going to start with, this is the best, and then I'm going to work my way down to answer your question of, Blackie, what if I don't have that? Okay. Number one, what is the best base there is? Well, the best base there is would be a browse bed. And this is the ends of conifer trees that have been cut and laid in a pattern to form an area large enough and thick enough. And I would then put logs in a outer boundary around it to keep it from spreading out until I built it up to a depth of something like that, and get up there and put the bedroll on top of that. That would be the best, okay, because it elevates and insulates. It lifts me up off of the ground to get away from the hard roots and rocks and everything, and it insulates me from the cold and heat or cold transfer from direct contact with the ground. So it elevates and it insulates. But Blackie, I'm not in the woods, I'm out on the Great Plains, just like the plainsmen did. There aren't any trees to maintain for fires or to build quick shelters and stuff like that. So what do? Well, one step down is going to be some other big debris pile. Leaves can be made into, if there are no trees. If there is no pine straw, no leaves, whatever, grasses can be harvested. And this was done by the pioneers of taking and cutting the tall, deep grasses and laying them in a grass bed to lay their bedrolls on top of, again, to elevate and insulate. Well, what if I don't even have that? Blackie, it's kind of low grass around here, and that's it. There's nothing big, you know, to utilize. Well, one of the things that the pioneers and the frontiersmen did was they cut the sod. They actually cut the ground, that grass, and cut it in blocks and picked it up out of the ground. This made a sunken bed on the cooler ground, and then they could stack those sods up as a wall, as a windbreak. They could also do that where they would just simply cut sod and stack sod on top of sod to make a bed 8-10 inches deep of cut dirt cut thick grass stacked one on top of the other like brick to lay on top of. They did that. Okay, Blackie, I don't even have that. I've just got dirt. Okay, so now you're going to need some sort of digging implement. Now, like everything else, you have to make up your area, your place you're going to. And you're going to have to remember location, location, location. I have come out and I am in a position where I'm in the wide open. Well, then I need to apply the 5 W's as best would apply for this. Now, if I'm in wide open, I don't have any widowmakers above me. That's pretty obvious. But I'm also still faced with wind, which is weather, we're going to say. Weather. Which way is the predominant wind coming from? Am I wanting to catch that to help cool me, or am I wanting to block it to keep myself from being cold? Is it going to rain or not? Is the ground wet or not? All of these factors will require slightly different techniques, and as we set this up, I will show you, it will discuss each one of those in turn. But the number one thing is I am looking for a convex, a crowned area to lay my bedroll on so that any water or whatever sheets away from me. I do not want to be in any concave area because water would flow down to me. Now, reverse that. If I'm facing a very cold wind, I may want to get a little lower, and so that cutting of that sod, of digging into the ground and mounding up the dirt on one side to make a windbreak may be very viable. So let's start to set up. I've got something to dig with, and let's talk about how we prepare the ground, the base. Okay, I've cleaned out an area here and got my sticks and everything out of the way to simulate this exercise of me having just dirt. I don't have anything else but dirt. Okay, first thing I'm going to figure out is how wide and how long. How wide is double your hip width. So from right here in my case to about right here. I'm just simply going to draw a line. About 36 inches. That's also an old trick that we used to talk about. What's your waist size? 36. So you make it 36 inches across. Okay. How long? I want it to go from my shoulder down to my feet. So I'm going to mark out an area 36 inches wide, roughly that big. Now, in between here, starting right here, I'm going to start turning over the dirt. To soften the dirt, breaking it up, getting out any roots or etc. This is important. Let me do this and I'll be right back with you. Okay, now what I've done is I've turned this dirt over down to a depth about 2 inches, 2-3 inches to soften it up. Now I'm going to look around and make sure I ain't got any big rocks or anything or roots sticking up. I do now have time to get rid of them. I've also created about a hand width area where I've gone down about 2 inches deeper. And where my hips would be, I've also done that as well, making that like 1.5 hands wide and tapering it in. So that my shoulder will lay in here, my arm can lay down in here. I've mounted the dirt up here because this will be where the pillow is. This is elevating the head, so the distance between here and here will be close to my shoulder height, from my shoulder to my head when I'm laying down. This will act kind of like a pillow and help elevate my head a little bit. This area in here is where my arm is going to go down in when I'm laying on my side, because I typically lay on my side, and this will be where my hip is going, in here. The rest of it is just roughed up to soften up the dirt. Okay, now that I've created the base to be able to keep me off the ground, keep my ground a little softer, I'm going to open up my tarp. Now, since I'm going to say that the predominant wind is coming from me toward the camera, I'm going to put the fold to this side, so the open end is to you. I'm going to bring it above my head, bring it out and lay it out flat. Making sure I'm kind of centered up on it. Now, I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to add in my element. Now right here is where my shoulder is going to be going. Right here. Right here is where my hip's going to be going. Now's the time that I have created it to lay down and test it out. I can make easier changes. Put my hip into that hole, lay down where my shoulder is, and put my head right there. Scoop that up. Pretty close, right there. Since I normally sleep on my right side, adjusting now the depth of the center section, the depth of the shoulder hole, the depth of the hip hole, will open this up and make it more comfortable to me to lay on. Right now, this is fairly comfortable. By mounting up this dirt like this, I have a natural pillow, so my neck's in a straight line. I'm not trying to sleep my head downhill. Any other insulation I add to it would be a real advantage right here. So this is usable as it is. Lay in several configurations and find out what's the best and how you want to be. Okay? Now's the time to find out. Not at 2 o'clock in the morning when you just cannot get that leg to quit cramping because it's in such an awkward position. You want it where you can move around. So you want this configuration to fit you. That's the important part. You've got to adjust the base to fit you. Alright, once that is in place, I will bring in my inner element right here. Now, in a U.S. Army poncho set for combat, they typically put it where it's tied in to the grommets of a poncho. This is so combat can just simply throw it open and roll out. That is not the good configuration when I'm trying to stay warm. I actually want it to go the opposite direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my blanket and lay it so it's just beyond shoulder width. Okay? So it's out of that hole. But the bulk of the blanket is not in the hole. Not covering me yet. And I'm going to spread it out. Just like this. Okay. Making sure all it's laid flat, there's no big wrinkles or seams in it. Now I will take this one and leaving it folded open, I will take the bottom of my sleeping bag or my cover element and I'm going to bring it across and I'm going to tuck it under just a little bit like that. Now if I have 2 blankets, which is even better because it's colder, I will put the one to the inside folding in the opposite direction, and I'll pull it down a little bit so that the top of it is almost at my shoulder. That way I can fold it under at my feet, and the outer one goes higher up to fold over my head. So I'm going to leave it kind of opened up in this V like this. Now I'm going to take my top element and come across just like this. Now down here at the foot, let me adjust the camera. Foot, I'm going to take this corner, fold it underneath. This corner, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bottom, fold under, then fold the top over, and then tuck it under. And finally, tuck the very bottom in so it makes this squared off. As I come up this edge, I'm going to do that again. I'm going to lift it up. I'm going to pull the inner side in and then pull the top over and tuck it underneath up until I get about halfway, or about where I'm going to be laying, about my hips or so, like this. The reason for that is water. If my bottom layer is coming out and my top layer is coming out evenly, this allows heat to be lost. It'll go right out between the two of them. As I breathe, I'm pumping up and down, and air is coming in and out of that seam. So I have to roll that seam over. By taking the inner one and pulling it up, and now taking the outer one and rolling it underneath, now the inner one acts like a seal and seals to it, and therefore prevents less critters coming in, and it lets me have less heat loss, because as I'm breathing, going up and down, which is pumping the whole bedroll, I'm not sucking cool air in around all the seams. All the seams all the way around are going to be rolled under in order to trap that warmth. Okay? Now we've got up here to the head. And let me show how we're going to get into it, and tips and tricks, if it was a bigger tarp, of ways to give yourself a little bit of head space. Okay? Okay. Okay, remember we talked about right here is the pillow that we created of dirt, right? If I'm a back sleeper and I'm going to lay on my back, when I pull this over, this is going to be laying directly on my face. That may irritate me a little bit, especially if I want my head covered, because I don't want rain or dew or whatever. So here's a trick. On either side of your pillow, take your boots and put your boots there. Now whenever I take and put my tarp over it, it makes this elevated place where I've got air coming in, but at the same time it's not laying directly on my face, see? Now, to close it up when I get in it, I'm going to come up here from the top, off this side. I'm going to open it up like this. Remember, it's halfway, and I'm going to slide in, going underneath this fold of the blanket. Once I'm in, I will grab it and pull it to cover me up. Then I'm going to roll into this side. I've already rolled it under, correct? I'm going to take it, put it over the top, and I'm going to reach out here, pull the inner in, take the outer, put over, and tuck it underneath like that, so that I am 100% sealed all the way around to right here. Up here at my head, we're going to put the boot here to represent the head. I'm going to reach out here and grab this corner and pull this corner down to tuck around my face. Imagine this is where my face would be. So I'm going to be laying on my side. This way I'm breathing fresh air. I can easily cover up my head. And by pulling this around me, it's tucked from my head all the way around. So I am therefore not losing any heat, and I'm not encouraging any other creatures to get into it with me. I'm underneath the roll. This roll action of rolling the edge, of taking the lower, folding it up, rolling the top over, and then putting the roll of the bottom back against it all the way around. Up here at the top, I'm going to grab and pull the back corner kind of toward me a little bit, And then I'm going to reach out and grab that corner and pull down here underneath my chest and put the top over. This will keep me from losing heat right here around my neck. Because I'm laying on the side, there'd be a big gap right here at my chest and at my back, right? And that's where the heat would flow up and out of the shelter. By tucking it in around my neck, I'm trapping that heat down here below it. Plus, most important, my breath is not wetting my blankets by condensation. If I didn't do this, and I think, oh, I'll just completely cover up, I'll end up wetting the blankets by condensation. Now for rain, I still want to bring it over the top of me, but remember I pulled in the bottom, so there'll be a loose edge all the way around up here at my face. So I'm getting fresh air in, but at the same time I'm not, building up condensation. Now, one other thing we need to address. This tarp, or none of these waterproof steel nylon tarps, whatever, do not breathe. So, anytime you're using a bedroll and you're in extremely cold conditions, you run a risk of suffocation if you put your head underneath and it freezes to the ground. I remember reading 10-15 years ago, it was probably in the 80s or so when it actually happened, at one of the Colorado trailheads for one of the hikings up there in the mountains. Apparently this young lady had probably got in very late, and so she had parked the car and just simply went a few feet away from the car up on the grass, and she laid down a bedroll. She took her tarp, laid it out, put her sleeping bag on it, folded it over the top of her, and it was a light sleeting rain, and she went to bed probably with the intention of getting up the next morning and starting on the trailhead. And rather than completely unpacking everything, she just made a bedroll right quick. The temperatures had plunged down and got very cold, and her breath had condensated on the inside, and with the cold and the temp and etc., it had frozen. So when the park ranger found her like 6:30 in the morning, walked up, she had suffocated because it had frozen all the way around that edge, and she had been asleep, had slowly smothered, had never woke up. So you need to think about that when you're going to use a steel nylon top or whatever. Always leave yourself the air source. So where this head area is up here, that's the reason I'm elevated, I'm going to pull that bottom layer to me and leave the top layer draped over me to keep rain, dew, or whatever. And therefore I've got a fresh air supply coming to me all the time. When I roll over, I reconfigure. Now, if you're one of those people at home that's always pulling yourself under the covers and pulling your covers over your head, you need to address that. Because if you pull all that sealed up tarp around your head, you may suffocate. So be wise here, okay? It's all a technique. It's a 1 in a million, but one's too many. So we're trying to address that and keep you up with it. Okay, you've got a ground bed now where you had nothing else other than the bedroll. We softened the dirt. We chewed it up. We put the 2 holes in place for the hips and the shoulder. We mounted up the dirt to make the head pillow to make us a little more comfortable, so we're not laying there with our head like that. We're at a normal angle. We can roll on our back, we can roll on our side. If it bothers you having the tarp laying on your face, you put your boots on either side or some other piece of gear, maybe your pack, right here beside of you. I've done that before. On the back side, where that seam is, I put my pack there, my haversack or whatever, to hold it up at an angle off my face a little bit. So that when I curl everything around me to keep the draft down, but I've still got a fresh air supply and it's directly off my face. That works very well. Now remember I said you want it crowned a little bit. You want it convex instead of concave, because we want the water to flow away from us. Well, what if we're going to be in heavier rain than that? Well, then we need to trench. And trenching is simply going all the way around this, cutting a shallow ditch all the way around. Now, this is easier to show you this way than it is to do it on the ground, trust me. Here is the edge of my tarp. Instead of digging here, I dig right up under the edge of my tarp, just under the edge of it, okay? I make it about the size of my fist all the way around, and then whichever is the downhill side where that water would accumulate and start to flow, I dig it down that way so the water is flowing across the ground coming toward me. It goes in that ditch and it's directed just like a rain gutter away from me. By putting it up underneath that edge, remember my whole tarp all the way around is bottom edge up, top edge down. If I put it where it's just laying flat, water may want to weak in and come between the layers to me. By bending the bottom layer up and putting the top layer on, I prevented that. I'm sort of in a shallow bathtub all the way around. And therefore it gives me a little bit of security from a pretty heavy downpour. So the water's not going to flow in here and float me out. So, in conclusion, 1, bedrolls are ancient. They work very well when you take and put a little bit of work into it. 2, if you're going to go with smaller and lighter, you've got to do a whole lot more groundwork to get the same comfort. 3, use a browse bed, leaves, whatever, as in elevation and insulation underneath you whenever you can get it. Only when you can't do you do this dirt set. How heavy a blanket? How cold is it? How much insulation do I need? How big a tarp? I want it to be big enough that when I fold it in half and seal it up, I have plenty of room to move without tearing it apart. If when I roll over it all comes apart, it's not big enough. It has to be big enough that in that configuration, when I roll over during the night, it's not going to pull that top layer off and expose me to rain or whatever. So I need it to be big enough. So you're not really saving a lot going with a bedroll versus going with a bivy sack or a tarp, a tube tent or whatever. You're really not, because you have to have a big enough tarp to function this way, and that adds bulk. I hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. If you have, please hit that like, share, and subscribe button before you go. I'd really appreciate it. Till next time, guys, I'm Blackie, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.